Okay, we now have Daisy join the research atelier, come with an idea, leave with a paper. Daisy, what's your idea?
So my idea is about money laundering. So we know that there are many laws and institutions that are combating money laundering, but it's been reported ineffective. And previous literature posits that corporate status can act as a social cue for misconduct detection and sanctions, but the findings are inconclusive. For example, some find that high status firms are less likely to be detected because they appear trustworthy or they're costly to invest. On the other hand, some also argue that high status firms are more likely to be detected because they have undesirable visibility for them in scandals, and they violate the expectation from the public or audience. But this line of research seems to assume that regulators disclose firms' misconduct automatically, and they play a objective and a neutral role in detecting misconduct organizations. But recent research find that regulators learn the crisis in their interactions with companies, but they use a conventional definition of the situation when they present those kind of crises to the public. So from these findings, we can see that regulators do not always play objective and neutral roles, but instead they sometimes be selective and strategic to detect or investigate the firms in misconduct. So in my idea, I import some insights from psychology literature. I hypothesize that common fate can be an important contingency to determine the effect of status on the likelihood of firms being detected. So common fate is defined as the coincidence of outcomes among two or more persons due to the same external forces or decision rules. And it's in the psychology literature is induced by a superordinate goal or identity shared by all individuals. I think it's appropriate to bring this individual level concept to firm level constructs, because in my context, firms and regulators do share a common fate, which is to obtain the integrity of financial system. And they also have a superordinate identity, which is the nation. So I think common fate is appropriate for this firm level study. Okay, so when the regulators and firms share a high level of shared common fate, the regulators will also be evaluated with the same criteria as the organizations. So when organizations do something bad, the public will also blame the regulators in the same way, that they share the same the common fate. But when there is a low level of shared common fate, the regulators will not be evaluated with the same criteria. There are very limited identity damage to the identity damage to organizations does not affect the regulators, so they are separately evaluated. So my main hypothesis is that the effect of status on the likelihood of being disclosed will be contingent on the level of common fate between the regulators and the firms.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all.
Thank you, Daisy. Let's start with, again, Aslı first, and then Alvaro, Ram, and Beth in that order.
I like the promise of this potential paper a lot, so I was very intrigued by it. Some of the things that I'm thinking about is the timing of regulators' action, and also how also the relationship between the probability of a firm engaging in such an activity, and you had the distinction between, I think it was low risk versus high risk jurisdictions. So the setting might encourage money laundering, and then suddenly you get called on, versus it was expected that you would be called on. So the first step in your kind of analysis is what kind of firms are likely to engage in this activity, given that it is the type of jurisdiction that it is, and you had it separated as low risk versus high risk. And then regulators' response is this kind of the second stage observation, that given that the money laundering and you control for the probability of a firm engaging in it, what kind of a engagement and the timing of the engagement that the regulator has with the firm. Now, I'm not so sure about the theory that you're using in terms of common fate, and that might also be related to my next question. If the sample firms are multinationals, if money laundering is in, I'm guessing it's supposed to be in a host country rather than home country, because it's harder to, it's easier to detect it if it's home country versus another country that they're operating in. So depending on that, I'm still lukewarm on this idea of common fate in terms of you teasing out the timing of action on the regulators, because I can have an alternative theory that because the firm has hired prior regulatory agency employees, they have better connections. Because of those better connections, simple social tie story, that they are really not called on first. So that would be my initial reaction.
Thank you. Well, I mean, we call MNCs who do these activities not money launderers, but they are financial wizards. So, I mean, this is quite normal, very expected. If you don't do it, you'll be doing something inappropriate. But maybe there's a sweet spot of how much you should be doing and not getting caught, right? Maybe that is.
And also a clear definition of what you mean by money laundering, to your comment, Ilgaz. I think we would need that.
Yes, thank you. Alvaro, please.
Yeah. Money laundering. It's a great story of misbehavior. Misbehavior is really difficult to analyze because you have in your particular case, two different, if you want, decisions, whether the company does engage in misbehavior or not, and whether the company is found to be engaging in misbehavior or not. And at the end of the day, what you're observing is those that have been, to some extent, prosecuted. The better companies, are they better because they do not do money laundering, or are they better because they do it and then they are really good at hiding it? And then the next step is the better companies. Are they better because they are not found guilty by the prosecutors in whatever country, or are they better because they are better at negotiating with prosecutors not to be investigated? So you're going to have lots of different stories, and the challenge with, and I'm telling you this because I've done work on corruption, the challenge with misbehavior research is that we observe only when you have the end of a series of decisions. And it's difficult to implement basically the idea of what is driving what. So that will be the first story to introduce. The second one is to clarify what you want to say, because there are, from your presentation, from the abstract, the idea, I mean, I like the topic, it's fantastic. The challenge is that I'm not fully clear what you're expecting here, and I personally, coming more from economics, I don't fully understand the story of using psychology to explain this, because you're talking about companies. If you were doing this at the level of the individual, by all means, why is it that I'm going to be misbehaving and trying to hide the money or not? At the level of a company, I think that the psychology approach is much more complex because you're talking about an organization, and especially if you're looking at large companies, multinationals, then things get complicated. The other thing that you have here driving the story is the country, the location, who is going to be prosecuting these companies. And there you are going to, and this is an opportunity as well, you can play with those differences and then which conditions in some countries there is this misbehavior that is going to be prosecuted or not. Take also into account that what we call or what you call money laundering in one jurisdiction may not be the same as in another jurisdiction. And now you have the story of geopolitics in play. And if you are helping some companies from a country move money, it's never an issue. Oh, but that's our enemy now. So all of a sudden you have that, yes, you are helping the enemy. It can become complex very quickly. It's going to depend on how far you're going into time and the countries that you have here. But the story, I think that you need to bring it out of something that you can analyze better. It's a big topic. It is fantastic. But the story of money laundering is, are we talking about the financial system, which I think is simpler to analyze. Different the story if you're talking about manufacturing companies. I don't think they really get into money laundering per se. I don't know. And the other story is who is laundering the money. Are we talking about companies trying to evade taxes, which is kind of a tax evasion story, or are we talking about criminal organizations, cartels, basically using companies to get their proceedings with the willingness of the company or unknown to the company? And these are two very different stories.
Thank you. Thank you.
Beautiful story, beautiful topic. You need to go deeper.
Okay.
Daisy, it is going very well. Right now, this is a very positive wind blowing in this room. So, Ram.
Yeah, I think the problem is, as Alvaro pointed out, I mean, it's a great topic, but I think there's a lot of holes in. First of all, what the hell is money laundering? I mean, Alvaro pointed out, it could be anything, and I would basically take money laundering and throw it and take it out. And stick to something much easier to define, like tax evasion. And then, you just focus on basically don't want to pay taxes. Now, the thing on money laundering, as Alvaro pointed out, is that the term is almost always used in the context of fundamentally illegal activities, right? So maybe drug cartels or whatever. Yeah, and Pfizer and money laundering, I mean, these sorts of, it just, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But the point is that that's not the terminology that's going to get you much traction. But on the other hand, we all know that every single major multinational firm uses tax havens, right? So every single firm does. They all have money that goes through the Cayman Islands. They all have money that goes through Bermuda. They all utilize these tax havens. They are all focused on their what I consider every top management team is focused on their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to maximize profits, and that's a good thing, right? So ultimately, the whole idea of corporate taxation is probably stupid in the first place, which I've written on, because they're extremely inefficient, and what it does is it forces companies to do these sorts of idiotic things. But nonetheless, that's the reality of the ground. These laws do exist. Corporate taxation rates are 18 to 20% around the world. The United States finally lowered their corporation tax from 38% to 20% after being double everybody else in the world for many, many years. But these vary across countries. Now, how would you identify how much of this is going on? I mean, one way to do that, you could probably track the foreign direct investment amounts by company through tax haven investments. I mean, that data is probably available. It may not be easy to get, but certainly something you could get. Okay, having said that, I agree 100% with Alvaro that basically take this psychology stuff and put it out the window. Okay, again, this is not you're talking about companies. And I think psychology is the wrong lens. I think the lens I would look at here is ultimately the approach of signaling theory. Because ultimately, what's going on? What's a high-risk location? A high-risk location is going to be one with a great deal of asymmetric information between counterparties. Now, there's a really wonderful paper in JFE by Mork Young and a third co-author whose name I forget, talking about identifying, which stock markets in the world have what level of asymmetric information. And they have a lovely methodology which you could look at. And ultimately, what they show ultimately is that when stocks move all in the same direction at the same time, like all stocks move in the same direction of the index, those are the markets which have very high levels of asymmetric information. And in the United States, where the level of asymmetric information is relatively low, we don't get this commonality of movement. Like all stocks don't go in one direction. They vary because stocks move on the basis of company-specific information. Whereas in high asymmetric information means that stocks move on the basis of general information. There's not very little company-specific information available, right? So in Indonesia, all the stocks go together, whereas in New York, stocks all go differently. So your high-risk location is one where there's high asymmetric information. Now, when you have a high asymmetric information situation, what's likely to occur is that the reason why you're going to get your result, which I thought was actually quite nice, your conjecture, I think, was very nice. It attracted me. And the reason why you're going to get that is because of pooling versus separating, right? So in signaling theory, what's ultimately going to happen in a high-risk location, you're going to get a pooling equilibrium, where investors cannot tell good firms from bad firms. And so basically, when a firm is caught, the contagion affects all firms, right? Good firms, everybody gets negatively affected if you're in a high-risk location. So the pooling equilibrium, the regulators have an interest in hiding it, or basically not telling anybody this has happened, right? But low-risk location, like say for example the United States, you have a low-risk location. What's going to occur is that we have separating equilibrium, right? So ultimately, Enron gets caught for doing all kinds of malfeasance, but that doesn't affect every firm on the New York Stock Exchange, right? Enron is punished, and their stock, but all the other unrelated companies, because investors can tell, right? Because there's no contagion because the equilibrium is separating. So that would be the theory I would take. I would use signaling theory, get pooling versus separating, get your high risk and low risk, and connect them to these asymmetric information idea, and go with that.
We'll come back to Ram again in the second round. Beth.
Okay, appreciate this. I have questions. I didn't know from your abstract what's your geographical context. Are you looking worldwide? And how are you defining high status organizations? What's the measure? I think that's actually, that's gonna, I think that's something you really need to drill down on. And similarly, a high-risk jurisdiction. And how does greater information availability affect this? And that's been kind of addressed before in terms of information asymmetry. I wasn't quite sure. Are you thinking if this is a firm level story or a national regulatory story? Or that wasn't so clear to me. And I didn't love the common fate angle. How much variation is there? Is this a strictly national level thing? What determines the variation in terms of common fate? And how would you even get at that? Is that a perceptual thing? Is it something that you can somehow measure? How does organizational culture come into play? I think that's, some organizations may not be terribly high status, but they're good organizations. Some organizations, this sort of behavior is much, look, as has been said, all MNEs do this. I've actually been accused of doing this, trying to get my money out of India. But some do it to a larger extent. And I think you've got to think about organizational culture here. And as Alvaro mentioned, the time factor matters. Regulations in some countries can change very, very quickly. And so that's something I think you would need to consider.
Beautiful. The first round
Back to
went
Ilgaz.
very well, actually, Daisy. This is very promising. So they are basically saying draw some boxes and arrows to see who is doing what to whom and why, right? So is it the state? Is it the person? Is it the firm? But look at it. Everyone is saying it is the firm. So take out anything that is non-firm, which would be entire psychology, basically. Okay, Aslı, second round. How would you fix this paper? How would you make it gorgeous?
I don't know about that. I mean, but I looked up, by the way, I was curious to see what how in this context, what would money laundering look like? For that term, there needs to be some illegal activity to happen that also is connected to tax evasion. I don't know how we can tie that to corporations in terms of the illegal component of it. Tax evasion is straightforward, and there are papers on it. What's also interesting is there's a journal on money laundering, and they have been cranking out papers on machine learning detection software that looks at bank transactions. So that might give us some idea about the variables to determine at least some of the major kind of contexts in which if a firm has those markers, they have high probability. It's not a certainty, but they have high probability. Now, the question is, why do we need this? So, I mean, other panelists have raised this issue. Why do we need this? It's about misconduct, right? But maybe there's a tension to be explored. Is it the context or is it the people? Mostly, in other words, do firms immediately have a Cayman Island bank account as soon as they're established, or do they end up migrating to having such a kind of account down the line? So is it an evolutionary kind of learned behavior, or is this kind of planned? That might be interesting. But in terms of the theories, actually, behavioral theory might be really, really interesting in this aspect, because if we're thinking about firms and their behaviors, then adoption of a certain type of behavior is we don't know the timing of it. Is it only because if others are doing it, I'm more likely to do it? Or what kind of a firm is thinking, yes, I'm going to be the first one to, in my industry, to have such a tax haven perspective? Or is it related to across the board external shocks about regulation, tax rate changes? And then if for instance, if it's related to tax rate changes and tax rate in the US drops, then we would see some of those accounts being closed, right? Because if that was the necessary business dynamics differences in financial systems type of a behavior, then we should see those kind of exits from markets where tax evasion is much more likely to happen. So those would be my current ideas.
Thank you. Alvaro?
Maybe think of in terms of types. Here I will start with types of companies. You have companies that are engaged in money laundering, and you have companies that help launder the money. And it's not quite the same story whether I am just trying to basically, I have a pile of cash, I don't know what to do, and how do I basically make it clean versus you have the pile of cash, I will help you basically make it clean. Not quite the same story. And here you also want to get into, are we talking about the companies with an actual business, a legal business, and they are basically getting into the legal side, or are we talking about entities that are completely illegal in terms of their activities, and they are trying to basically become legal? So it's not quite the same in terms of how things are moving. And then the other thing that you may want to get into is the importance of the event, which now you need to match with actual regulation. Are we helping Russian companies evade sanctions? Are we helping North Korea move nuclear material and the payment of nuclear material, or are we helping the local Italian mob basically get money out of their illegal drugs in the city? Not quite the same story, not quite the same relevance if you want. You will probably have to get deeper into the actual laws and regulations and what they define as money laundering, because money laundering is basically anything more or less under the sky that is not fully regularized. My guess is that most people will not quite see it the same as well. You don't declare all the taxes, and you have some money that was paid under the table, versus that you're actually helping transfer arms or drugs around the world. There are lots of things that I think it's too broad. You could play with lots of different variations, and then if you have multiple countries, then you could play with how you have variations in terms of those specific laws and regulations and under which conditions they are likely to be prosecuted. Final comment, local versus foreign companies. The high versus low status, I'm not sure how to understand it. I understand the foreign versus local companies, and you see that much more often, at least in the realm of corruption, which I know I have done some work. Local governments are much harsher when corruption happens and it's the foreign companies doing it than when it is the local ones. And maybe that's a way to basically get into the high and low status, but I don't understand high and low status. Foreign versus local, I think it's just simpler, something that is easier to grasp. I think will be good for this particular research line.
Thank you. Ram?
I think I mentioned some. I'm with Asli here. I think I would. I don't think money laundering is a valuable approach. And there's too many things underneath it, and I think if you're trying to get out at Russian mafia, you're not going to get the data. There's no data on Colombian or Mexican drug gangs. Yeah, I mean, they're out there, but it's going to be empirically impossible. So I would junk that idea. On the other hand, tax evasion, I think, or tax avoidance, I think, is probably a better term. That data should be available, right? So because all firms try to, and you can look at, first of all, the prevalence. I mean, this is what regulators have been doing, the European Union regulators especially. Look at the prevalence or extent of profits reported in low tax jurisdictions versus high tax jurisdictions. And the European Union, for example, has been going after Apple and Google and all the American corporations for over-reporting their profits in Ireland, for example. Because obviously Ireland has 10% corporate tax rate, and Germany has 18% corporate tax rate. Why the hell would you not report more profits in Ireland? It makes perfect sense, right, for the firm to do that. But you do. I mean, it's not. There's a certain amount of unpackaging of foreign subsidiary performance data that's available, and I think there was a law passed in 2014, I think, where they, I think the FASB, there's a new FASB regulation, which caused firms to unpackage further in terms of what they report. And so that might give you, first of all, that's a bit of a natural experiment, because obviously after that unpackaging, firms might behave a little differently. People now have to report versus before I didn't have to. I could just bundle everything, and nobody really knew where the profits are actually, where I'm reporting the profits, and now I have to tell people. So that gives you some kind of an empirical approach. High status and low status, again, I would take that out, but I would stick with the idea of pooling versus separating, and basically say that locations are going to vary in terms of risk, and the kind of risk you're particularly interested in is the risk of contagion, and contagion is going to be high in areas where stock markets are extremely coterminous, where basically everything moves together, and that you can ask. There's data available. I mean, that you know where that happens. Country by country, so you probably get at least 60 or 80 different countries where you could distinguish that.
Thank you. But building on Ram and Alvaro and Aslı, I actually get the sense that they are talking about the three mentors, and I'm going to ask Beth in a second. They are talking about an evolutionary path. It's like a story about the life cycle of moving money better than your rivals. It's like you're explaining over 200 years the shipbuilding industry, how it evolves from the England. It goes down to Korea. How did it end up in Korea? Why not in some other part of the world? Why was it? Why it started in England and it finally is domiciled in Korea? So you're basically talking about a natural progression to things, because look at what Ram is saying. Ram is saying, how come people are not going and flooding to Ireland because of the 10%? Right? There's an expected evolutionary path. So the answer is, as always, in Beth Rose. Beth, what do you say?
I didn't pick up on that. This is why it's good to have lots of people. I agree with the advice you've been giving. I think money laundering is a catchy title, but I think you would really, really need to drill down on what you mean. Are you even thinking about illegal activity or kind of marginally okay business practices? So I think you need to think hard about that. I would suspect there are going to be industry effects that you're going to need to look at, and country effects, both home and subsidiary, and that's been addressed a bit, but there'll be interactions there to look at. And I guess a question that occurs to me that could potentially be interesting are regulators turning a blind eye? Are they not also not acting illegally? Why do the regulators turn a blind eye, and how do bribery and corruption come into play? And if you're doing this globally, that's something you can't ignore.
Thank you. Last round, again, let's come up with one great hypothesis to give a direction to the argument. Let's start with Aslı again, please.
I think it's too soon for me to have a hypothesis, but maybe I'd put this more in the context of power and politics and firm government relations. And if you have international data, even better. And maybe that can get me closest to a hypothesis, because there is if you're a firm and you are trying to, and this is a legitimate business practice, if you are trying to pay the least amount of tax, then there are certain steps you're going to be taking, right? So what are those steps? For instance, I'm more likely to try to be a government supplier or a buyer, especially if I'm in a concentrated industry. Why? Because I'm tying the government into the same transaction. So it's harder for the government to actually, if I'm caught on doing something, it's harder for them to kind of release it. Maybe I'll start donating, to Beth's point. So my rate of lobbying to whichever party I lobby, maybe that's going to make a difference. The bigger I am, the more easier for me to build these precursor ties so that I can comfortably move into a location or move my money to wherever there's a low tax bracket. And it also probably is going to help me get the tax advice of big consulting and accounting firms, right? If I'm Apple, I'm more likely to get that expertise from a big accounting firm than I'm a smaller size firm trying to, how would that conversation go? I want to pay the least amount of taxes. Therefore, would you set something up for me? right? And we have the social responsibility theme happening. So how are all those dynamics are happening? That's how I would maybe position it, and I'd be able to include some stories, some examples to highlight where I'm going with this. I can get the tax data, I can get the location data, I can also look at government's federal contracts, which are public, and then search those databases for the firms that are in my sample. So that's what I would kind of go in terms of the route. And then I'd say power and politics. And it's a form of social network ties, which are actually substituting legal obligation, right? So you are kind of substituting one type of relationship with government with another type of relationship with the government, which is, one of them is much more of a social tie, the other one is legal obligation, which is you have to pay taxes.
Thank you. Alvaro, please.
Building on the story of political relations, you can play with different types of companies, state-owned companies versus private companies. State-owned companies, are they likely to be prosecuted? Well, they are part of the state. How do you prosecute the managers versus the private companies? And within private companies, the big conglomerates? Think about what happened with the Korean chaebols. They were really connected with the government, really difficult to prosecute them. The big surprise is that the head of Samsung ended up in jail. You can also play with changes in government, especially for countries that basically are not that democratic. You have a transition in government. I was good friends with the president. And then all of a sudden there is a new president. Oh, you were in bed with those and basically going to prosecute. And of course, all these things come to light so that you can play with this idea of to what extent your connections with the government help you prevent or minimize the level of investigation and prosecution. Playing with the story of lobbying in the US, large companies, for the most part, give donations to both parties. Why? Because, hey, you never know. If the Democrats win, hey, I was a good donor. If the Republicans, oh, look, I already gave you the money. This story, you can play with it. Some of them choose one versus the other, and maybe you can basically play with that. The other thing that maybe you want to explore is the actual level of evasion and then the level of prosecution. And for that, you have the Panama Papers and later the Paradise Papers. This was a big cache of lots of offshore accounts in Panama, lots of extremely wealthy people and lots of companies that were literally hiding money there. A big brouhaha, I think almost 10 years ago, 2015, 2016. I don't really know who has been prosecuted. Maybe you could play with that database, and if you can match it with country-specific prosecution, see who was basically, in some cases it was obvious, they were the dictator, they are not going to be prosecuted for anything, they just basically found that they had money in Panama. In other cases, you have individuals, sports stars, singers, things like this, were they prosecuted or not, so that you could play basically with this story. As an individual, you are prosecuted. You're a big company. Well, so sorry, we won't do it again. You could play with lots of things. It's a great topic, but back to the story that everybody's mentioning, money laundering. It can be pretty much anything. It will be nice if you either go with tax evasion or you go for something that you can grab and explain more easily for everybody, and then play with differences across companies and also differences across regulatory entities and locations.
Thank you. Ram?
Yeah, I think in terms of generating hypotheses, again, I think we're all sort of glomming onto the same thing, that you need to come to something that that you can actually get data on. that there is now whether there's going to be some prosecution or not prosecution. This is a different story. I think to some extent you may. I mean, I don't know if it's going to fit with your abstract, but clearly that there is a foreign versus local aspect. Like foreign companies are more likely to get prosecuted than domestic companies. I, for one, think, for example, that the European Union, for example, almost all of their lawsuits are filed against American companies. Why is that? Because American companies are profit shifting more. Of course not. I mean, basically, the European Union is basically, the American companies are the enemy, and German companies are our companies, and so of course we don't prosecute German companies for doing exactly the same thing. I mean, German companies report just as much profits in Ireland as American companies do, but American companies are sued by the European Union for that. So I think you might get some traction on that kind of prediction. But I think what you might be able to get is these effects might be positively, you might get second order effects based upon the risk of the location. In other words, you might get, if you take a cross term of that foreign domestic dummy with, for example, a high risk location, like for example in Indonesia, you might find that is much stronger or much weaker. It depends. I mean, it's unclear which way it goes. Because you might want to, if you're a very high asymmetric, high risk, high asymmetric conversion country, you might want to minimize the perception, negative perception, since investors cannot tell one company from another, right? All they can see is the location. Whereas the European Union is a low risk location, because they have, obviously there's a lot of low asymmetric information, a lot of information is available and reported. And so the European Union is much more likely to prosecute, because they're less worried about, if you prosecute Google, is that going to affect all of the EU? Well, probably not, right? Because people can unpackage Google from other companies in the European Union. So you might expect that this foreign bias in terms of prosecution might actually be weaker in high-risk locations because asymmetric information is high. And like I said, if you're in Indonesia, maybe you don't want people to get a negative signal from your market.
Thank you, Ram. And Beth?
Okay, you want sort of pulling together what a lot of people have said. An overriding hypothesis that you're going to have to break down a lot. Firms with greater country embeddedness are less likely to be accused of tax-related misconduct. That could be an hypothesis.
Say no
but
more.
You need to look
Say
at
no
that.
More. That is it. That is it.
Oh, no.
That is gorgeous. Don't miss this moment. This is gorgeous. Anything you say more, addition to this one is going to ruin it. No, please go ahead.
Daisy, I'll send you the more detail later.
Thank you.
That was a very good point, actually. Building on Ram, exactly but look at the way that they are thinking. It's an empirical question. If in Ireland, US is treated differently than Germany, and Beth is basically saying the same thing, why? Why are they being treated differently? It's not the company, but there's something behind, right? That is the interesting thing. There's something behind this choice of why they are doing it. And Beth had a great start. So let's continue with Beth. I was joking, Beth. So what is the next step for Daisy's paper?
I think really decide what it is you want to look at. Because I think you need to look, I mean, lots of issues have been raised, and I think they're all really important. Is it the home country or the host country? Is it a foreign firm versus a local firm? What kind of embeddedness? Is it financial embeddedness? Is it political embeddedness? Is it social embeddedness? One of the arguments about CSR is that it creates local legitimacy. So I think you really need to tease this out in a lot more detail.
Okay.
And I think, you know, whether you're looking at an official accusation of tax-related misconduct, or is it just in the press? So I think, you know, these you've got a lot of different papers here. This is good. But I think you need to really drill down and get a lot more detail.
Thank you. Daisy, are you happy and do you know what you will be doing?
I'm super happy. Thank you so much. I'm basically taking the notes and will first get to the next step to make it more detailed and more specific.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to stop
Thank
the
you for
recording
getting up
now.
so early.
By the way, Ilgaz, I need to go feed my dog, so I'm gonna take a short 5-minute
Sure.
break.
Sure.
I'll be back.
Thank you.
Yep.